It's always important to me whenever I speak to show this video because it puts a face on the very real loss that takes place across this country on our behalf to give us the right to meet here today. And before I get started, if I could just take 1 minute and ask if there are any veterans in the room today, would you please stand and just remain standing and for just a few minutes. Could you please stand right now? Because I want to look you in the face when I say this. There is not a group of humans on this planet that I have more love, honor, and respect for than you. And I want you to know that those of you who came in front of us, I want you to know that our family never took for granted one day of our lives. The freedom you provided for us, the ability you gave me to raise a family in freedom, my husband and I. And I thank you. You can be seated. Thank you. Back to our founder. Lighthearted here a minute. I was so glad to be in the first service, Pastor Steve, and see how animated you were, because I was afraid that I would be really strange here, because I'm like a pacer and a walker, and I move, they call it the knife hand all the time, you know. So I'm glad to see that your congregation is used to this, and thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you for having Billy and I. Before I get started, let me just introduce my husband, Billy Vaughn. If you would just stand up and let everybody see your beautiful face. Never, is never, and will never be free. And I like how you clarified in the first service, those of you who weren't here for the first one are in for a treat, about the difference in liberty and freedom. And maybe I should rephrase that to liberty was never free. And, you know, the truth is we've always known that it had to be fought for, protected, and defended, as that famous Ronald Reagan quote tells us, or one day our children and our children's children will have to tell them what it was once like in America when men were free. In fact, over 41 million. Now I'm going to get excited, and I just want to tell you something. It's okay to clap in church, because if you get excited about something, let's just pretend we're at the ball game today. Let's go ahead and celebrate America, celebrate what's been sacrificed on our behalf, and not be afraid to express ourselves in God's house the way we express ourselves outside of God's house. Because if there's any place we should celebrate freedom, it's here. Because only in America has this liberty given us the right to exercise to celebrate. Do you realize that over 41 million Americans have fought for this country during times of war? Over 41 million, and over 1.3 million have paid their last full measure in the protection and defense of our liberty here in America. And I told him in the first service, but I always like to do this, because in this world where we're talking about billions, how many zeros that is, I don't. So I like to make 1.3 million make sense to people, bring it back into perspective. If I took a $1 bill and I laid it on the floor, I would have to stack those dollar bills 56 stories high to represent the American sons and daughters that have given their lives in this country. 56 stories high. And let's just go ahead and double that to 112 stories high for every mother and father left without a child. On the morning of August 6th, Billy and I woke up to the nightmare of just what that cost really meant. We thought we understood, but we honestly had no clue until on the morning of August 6th, we woke up and found out that our only son, Navy SEAL Aaron Vaughn, had made it to the pinnacle of his career, to the pinnacle of his life. He was married to a beautiful woman that, believe it or not, I used to tell him all the time, this is going to be the best story for you to tell your children one day, because on Aaron's very first deployment as a U.S. Navy SEAL, he was deployed to Africa, and he was in Guam for a night. And guess who was there in Guam? And it's kind of a really cool story because, as you can see, this girl is a believer. Don't let this completely define anything in your head. But, lay down all those perspectives. But she was also a Washington Redskins cheerleader, and she was on a USO tour in Guam. And they met one night, fell in love, maintained an opposite coast relationship. Her in D.C. and him in California, for almost 2 years till they married. Fell in love over the phone. So by the time he died, she had given birth to Reagan. If that tells you anything about our family. Just saying. Who was almost 2 years old when his daddy left this earth, and a beautiful daughter, Chamberlain, who was 9 weeks old when her father died. So he was at the pinnacle of his life. He was also at the pinnacle of his career. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about his story. Aaron, on the night he died, let me finish that. And our family found out just how gut-wrenchingly painful the cost of freedom truly was. Aaron was killed in a helicopter shoot-down in the Tangi River Valley of Afghanistan, along with 20. Have you ever seen a list of names that horrific in your life, to think that many men died in a single shoot down? 22 members of the famed SEAL Team 6, who only 93 days earlier had taken out the kingpin of terrorism, Osama bin Laden. But let me tell you about Aaron. Aaron was a child who gave his heart to Christ at a very young age. He was always larger than life. It's one of the hardest things that we grapple with as a family, is to just not have his presence in our home anymore, because he was the kid who was always saying, hey, y'all, watch this. And you know what follows that, right? It's like a trip to the ER or something like that, but it was always exciting when Aaron was around. There was always going to be something being blown up, something being shot. It was just going to be crazy. But, as a matter of fact, when he was just a kid, his father got him a BB gun, those pump action BB guns, and he said, son, never pump it more than 2 times. First time out the gate, he shoots his cousin in the rear end as she's climbing over a fence on our 47-acre farm in West Tennessee. And that was always how he was, but he had pumped it like 6 times, so he left a pretty good welt on her, on her backside. But anyway, he was a kid who gave his life to Christ at a young age, and he always had this discernment that was so uncharacteristic of boys his age. And what I mean by that, and this is really important, he was always able to discern evil. He was always able to know that something must be done about evil. And I think it's a big statement, because I fear that in our current culture especially, we don't like to So I think that's why so many of us just turn our face and say, I don't want to see it. I don't want to know it. But that's not who Aaron was. From the time he was young, he was worried about Saddam Hussein and what the man was doing to his people there. No joke. He used to lose sleep over it. It stressed him. He was a young boy who was so courageous that by the time he was 8 years old, he'd tell anyone who cared to listen that one day he was going to be a Navy SEAL. I didn't even know what a Navy SEAL was. His dad had told him what one was, and he decided, well, if that's the best of the best, and I'm sorry for anybody who served in other branches, but that's what his dad told him. That was, if that's the best of the best, that's what I'm going to be, because Aaron wanted to take it to the enemy. That's the kind of heart he had. And Billy says this so poignantly, and I've started repeating it, because anytime he has a really good line, I steal it, because that's just the way it works in marriage, right? But he says that Aaron didn't become a warrior after he became a Navy SEAL. Aaron became a Navy SEAL because he was a warrior. You saw that picture of how skinny and scrawny he was, with his attempt at muscled up look. He was a skinny kid. He ended up being 6'4" tall, and he was nearly that tall by the time he was about 12, I think. I don't know. That might be an exaggeration, but he was that kid who just shot up like a bean sprout, and he was always awkward, the kid who tripped over his own feet. Finally really filled that body in. And by the time he was in high school, he had become a very formidable football player. Had probably a small college career in front of him, nothing major, but he was doing good. And just before the first game of his senior season, he was in practice, and I drove up to watch him. And I remember coming up to the football field that day, as I'd always go watch his practices, because I loved watching his intensity on the field. I pulled up, and the entire team was gathered around somebody writhing in pain on the ground. And guess who it was? As I got closer, the coaches were like, "Mrs. Vaughn, get out here, get out here. It's Aaron. He's hurt his knee." After all the tests were run, we found out that he had obliterated the anterior cruciate ligament in his left knee. And if any of you know, that's a pretty serious injury. And so he had surgery and had that ligament replaced, had torn all the other ligaments. They did as much repair in his knee as they could. And just to tell you the tenacity of this young boy, and the drive that he had to fulfill his dream of becoming a Navy SEAL, to get back on course, in 6 months he was running a 4.440. If that means anything to you who are athletic in here, it was ridiculous for a man of 6'4" tall. And so everything got back on track. The course for his future was back in place. And let me just stop real quick and ask you, how many of you, I bet there will be just less than one handful count in this room. How many of you have known anybody who wanted to be something great from the time they were a child? Something larger than life, something most people just dream of achieving. How many of you know somebody who knew what they wanted to do their whole life, knew what they were created for, and did it? Very few of us, right? There's a few. I'm still trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be when I grow up. One of these days. But Aaron Vaughn was that man. And so, like he said, he got himself back on track. This dream of his, it was going to be fulfilled. And just before school let out, his senior year, he was 17 years old when he graduated. But just before school let out that year, he was playing a pickup game of basketball with some friends, and he obliterated that anterior cruciate ligament again. This time, unfortunately, the doctor came out after about 2 hours in the surgical suite, and he said, "Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn, I have bad news. There was nothing I could do to repair Aaron's knee. There was too much damage. There's no bone left on either side of that ligament to attach a new ligament to." And this is what he said. He's going to spend the rest of his life somewhat handicapped. And listen to this. He'll never be able to do anything physical again without the use of a special brace. Well, that didn't sit well with Aaron. It was a devastating time in his life. When he woke up from that anesthetic fog, I remember watching him, as he struggled with this path that God had changed and trying to figure out what he was supposed to be now. Just at that time where he was supposed to go out and achieve that dream, everything got flipped upside down. And it's funny how God does stuff like that. And I'll explain in a minute why it's so crucial that he did that, why it's so important that God did that, or allowed that, I should say. So Aaron resigned himself to this life, this changed life. He tried to decide what he was going to be. He got a job on a golf course in South Florida, which is a good job. That company actually sent him to college in golf course management, and he was lined up for a brilliant, successful career. Everything was moving great until that day came that changed everything for every one of us in this state, across this country, and across the globe, and that was, of course, September 11th, 2001. And I remember Aaron was 20 years old when the towers fell. And I remember out of all the stories that came in the aftermath of that horrific day in our nation's history, the one that got to our boy the most was the story of those 40. Because we realized that, the government had been ineffective in stopping one single terror attack where 3 planes achieved their goal. But guess what? The people of this country, the ordinary people of this country, when they heard what was happening, they took their place in history and they altered what could possibly have been that day the most damaging attack we would have suffered. And so when he heard that battle cry that came out of Todd Beamer's mouth, when we started hearing this, let's roll, when we started hearing those stories of all those whispered prayers of family members telling their loved ones goodbye on cell phones, it stirred something in him. That boy came home on his 21st birthday, and he sat down at the table with Billy and I, and he said, "Mom and Dad," just as if he'd said, "I stopped and got ice cream." He said, "I stopped by the Navy recruiter's office today, and I joined the SEAL Challenge program." Yeah. And And, I'm sitting there as a mom, my mind, I sometimes I try to be funny about this because it was so heavy, but I'm sitting there as a mom thinking, I got to write a note. We were at war. People were dying. And so all of this is going through my head. And so I guess in my weak attempt to see if I could figure out how to manipulate, some sort of shift in this whole thing, I said, well, does the Navy know about your knee? And he said, well, of course not, or they'd have never let me in the program. So I'm like, wonderful. I thought that would be my out, but he was doing it, Make a long story short, jumping ahead in time, Aaron did move into the SEAL Challenge program. BUDS Class 248, that's basic underwater demolition SEAL training. BUDS Class 248, where you see the shows about Hell Week and all that stuff, started with 157 men. Not only that, and of course he never wore his brace because his brace would have betrayed his secret. He had to do all of it with that incapacitated knee where he was supposed to never be able to do anything athletic again. Not only that, in Coronado Island off the coast of California, there is a wall in the BUDS compound that reads, "First time, every time." Of the few tried it, guess whose name is on that wall? And here's what I'm going to tell you. I don't say that to brag on Aaron. Aaron was the most humble man you would ever meet in your life. He never ceased praising God for giving him the ability to do what he'd been called to do. Came from. He never pounded his chest and said, look what I did. He always pounded his chest, pointed up and said, look what God did. And so I'm going to, on the morning of August 6th, when Billy and I found out that our only son had been killed in action, we knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Aaron Vaughn was exactly where he was supposed to be at the exact appointment and time, doing exactly what he was created to do. And in that came great comfort. In the wake of Aaron's death, our family started an organization called Operation 300. And in Operation 300, what we do is we host adventure camps for kids whose fathers have fallen in service to our country. We bring them in for a weekend of just extreme fun. It's not a grief camp. It's not like any of those other things. This is a camp where they live for a weekend. Where they come in and they have father-aged male mentors that they chop wood with, they build fires, they shoot these little guns. And I don't know if it's politically correct to say this here, but they have these 22 those guns, and they shoot bow and arrows, and they ride horses, and they sail, and they deep sea fish, and they do all of these incredible things. But the most important thing they do is sit around with those male mentors at night and see what it looks like to be in the presence of men, because that's what they miss in their life, to just the fellowship of men, the way they communicate, the way they laugh, the way they play. And they have this extraordinary weekend. And at the close of one of our camps a few months ago, my husband Billy, who's one of the most profound speakers you would ever hear in your life, which embarrasses me for me to be speaking when he's sitting there. But I will tell you, he stood up in front of that crowd of about 30 little boys and girls and their moms, those widows sitting there. We bring their moms in as well and put them up on an oceanfront resort so they can just have a weekend of relaxation, all expenses paid, so they can get to know other moms who are living the same life they're living. But he's looking at that crowd of little boys and girls and those widows, and he says the most profound thing. He says, I want to tell you something. Your daddies didn't die for a government. Your daddies didn't die to seize land. Your fathers died for a way of life. The American way of life. And I want to take it a step further. They fought because they knew in their heart that America, with all her flawed citizens, with all of her bumps and bruises, with all of our faults and failures, is still the greatest land on earth. They knew. That's right. Praise God. They knew that a representative republic is Ronald Reagan ever. The American soldier, what separates us from every other country is this. The American soldier doesn't fight because they hate what's in front of them. They fight because they love what's behind them. They fight to protect and defend, to guard and hold. That's why they fight. They also fight because I'll tell you something, they know that if America ever fails, there will be no place left to go. You don't see people making makeshift rafts trying to boat their way into Cuba and just breach the shore long enough to become a citizen. You don't see us busting down fences trying to get into Mexico. You know, I get BBC alerts. You know why? Because they come out 5 hours before America's alerts, you know, and I get news alerts all the time. So it goes off in the middle of the night and it's like, dun, 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 dun. I'm like, ah. What? You know, oh my gosh. It always does that in the middle of the night. And not long ago, listen to this, not long ago I had, and Pastor, tell me when I need to quit because I can really get going here. I guess you can't tell that. Went off in the middle of the night a couple weeks ago. Fathers, mothers, and children have been killed at sea trying to get out of Syria. I'm sure they were Christians, trying to escape ISIS and its persecution. And I thought, do we even appreciate what we have? Do we have any clue what it looks like to live outside the security of freedom? And for a minute, I just pictured drowning. Because their option was die at sea or be slaughtered or have my children taken into captivity by these wretched, hellish figures who are going to rape and torture and brutalize them until they're done with them and destroy them. So they build a little makeshift raft and they go out to sea. And we sit here. We go to our barbecue this afternoon. We have no clue. We have no conscious awareness of what it looks like to live in that kind of slavery. We beat ourselves up as a nation because we had slavery, but let me tell you something. We abolished it because we're good, because we knew better. All over the country, all over the world, people are in captivity, but not here because we, Americans, got it right and we fought and died. We gave our lives to stop it. So I'm sick of this controversial, America is bad, we're evil because of mistakes we made in the past, because we're the only nation who corrects our mistakes. We're the ones who fixes them. We don't survive under them and let it maintain that status quo. We get it right and we die to do it. We die to do it. So don't tell me this nation is horrible. Don't ever say that to me. I know we've got our problems. I'm completely aware of what our problems are. But I'm going to tell you something. I believe in this country. And I believe in this country's people. And I believe that this country was based on Judeo-Christian principles, which will sustain us if we will re-engage in the process. And let me just tell you something. I don't know what it looks like in Ohio. I was born in Akron, Ohio, by the way, so I can talk to you frankly. But I'm going to tell you something. In Florida, 1.2 million Christians did not vote in the 2012 elections. How dare we? He gave his life for you to have that right. How dare we sit back in our pews and say, or our chairs, they're way more comfortable. We are a representative republic. That means only when we put the representatives in office will we have our values fulfilled in this land. We have an obligation. We have a moral obligation to fight for the proper candidates. Then we have a moral obligation to keep them in line when they get there. I'm tired. You know, I've been asked this question a few times, and it shocked me enough that I decided to just address it publicly, because I'm sure people want to know, but most people will never ask me. I've been asked this question: was America worth it? And I want to answer you with an unequivocal, absolute yes. She was worth it. And I'm going to tell you something. I see the beauty of what's been handed to me, what's been fought for on my behalf. I see it everywhere I look. And if you don't see it, let me just encourage you to do a couple things. Let me encourage you today to drive by a park and see a family with their kids playing on playgrounds, laughing without fear. Mothers sitting around, no, they won't be sitting around talking. They'll be sitting around texting each other who's on the bench right beside them, probably some nonsense like that. But there, let me tell you this. Pick up a ticket to a Friday night high school football game. You'll see America. You'll see what's great about us. And if that doesn't do it for you, then drive by the parking lot of any church across this country, seeing people worship freely, whatever God they choose to worship, because we're in freedom, because we have the liberty to do so. You'll see it. And I'll tell you something else. You know, in this constant news cycle of bad news, and Lord knows, Billy and I are on top of it. That's all we do with our lives, to stay on top of this horrid news cycle. It's gut-wrenching most of the time, but that's what we do, is try to address culturally the battles that our son fought kinetically. So we're in it. We get it. But I'll tell you something. If we could just turn the news off for a day and just look around at the people surrounding us today, or sit back at our barbecues tomorrow, where, by the way, almost 7,000 families will be celebrating tomorrow without their son or daughter who's died in this war right now. But if we could sit back at that barbecue tomorrow and we could look around, step back from it for a minute and look at what's been given to us, we would see it. And I'll tell you something, I see the reason Aaron Vaughn gave his life everywhere I look. And I'm proud of him for what he did. And you know, what I want to say too is this. It's not just that we're a great country. It's not just that we provide liberty, we provide freedom, but we're a good people. You know, I don't remember who said it, but somebody said, it's probably Ronald Reagan, because I read his stuff all the time. I don't think it was. But you know, it said, if America ever ceases to be good, she'll cease to be great. Now I'm going to tell you something. I travel across this country. America has not ceased being good. I can tell you that firsthand. We got a lot of upside down. Do today is I want you to believe in this nation. I want to ignite people again to love this country. I want to ignite people, engage them in celebrating who we are rather than demeaning who we are, because we are a great nation. We are a good people. And I want to tell you a story that demonstrates that. And I haven't ever shared this until just recently. Somebody sent me a video on Facebook of a casket coming off of a Delta flight with another small casket for the soldier's dog that was, you know, right behind it. And I was looking at that video, and, you know, in the haze of Aaron's death, you know, you're just kind of like a shell of a person after you bury your son, or when you're in that process, you know, you just really don't even know what's going on. But I remember seeing in that video, I remember thinking and remembering what happened to Billy and I when we were being transported to Washington, D.C. to be with our newly widowed daughter-in-law and our 2 grandbabies the day after Aaron died. And I want to tell you what happened. The pilot came over the intercom, and he asked the entire plane to remain seated while we exited the plane. And then the pilot escorted us to his private waiting area on a cart, until we could go to our next flight, where he again took us on a cart. And as we're on that cart, we're driving by, and all of a sudden I gasp, because my son's face is on the front page of every single newspaper in this media rack right there, and we all stop in silence. I want to tell you about the stewardess who folded up a note telling me how grateful she was for my son's life and stuck it in my hand with tears running down her face. I want to tell you about the way to camp. Don't be driven away from it. But you know, we know, like I said, we know we're in hard times. I'm going to wrap this up because I know it's almost time for the next service to start. I know we're in hard times. But I want to tell you something. You have to get engaged. The Christians no longer have an option of remaining silent and letting somebody else do the dirty work. You got to fight for this liberty, or it's going to be gone. You know, Ronald Reagan, sorry. He said, one of my very favorite quotes is, "You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We can preserve this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we can sentence the next generation to take the first step into 1,000 years of darkness." And this is my favorite part. He says, if we are destined to fail, if this way of ours is to be lost, then at least let our children's children say of us that it did not fail, because we failed to try. And I want to end with this. Whether you believe it is or not, inaction is action. What you choose not to do will alter the course of history as much as what you choose to do. So choose to stay in this fight. Choose to defend our defenders. Choose to defend our republic. Choose to be engaged. And choose to never forget what's been sacrificed on our behalf. And last, choose to live lives worthy of the sacrifices that have been made for our liberty. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to ask if you would, we're going to make our way outside. The color guard is here for presentation, 21 gun salute. And I'm going to ask Billy if you and Karen would go before us. Also, those who have served in the military, if you would go first as well, if you would make your way out. And then church, ask you to go out into the parking lot area. And you can go right out this door, right out here, out the side, right out here. There we go.